The morning of May 27, 1942, Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. Yorktown is in Dry Dock 1. She arrived 2 days ago from the Coral Sea, where Japanese bombs had opened her hull, buckled her flight deck, and killed 66 of her crew. Naval engineers estimated 90 days of repair work, possibly more. Chester Nimitz had given them 72 hours. Full 1,400 workers went aboard: welders, pipe fitters, electricians, damage control specialists, working in shifts around the clock. They sealed compartments that couldn't be fully repaired. They shored up damaged frames with whatever structural material was at hand. Some of them never left the ship between the moment she entered dry dock and the moment she left it. On May 30th, Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor under her own power. Her pumps were jury-rigged. Some compartments were still wet. Welders were still working inside her when she cleared the harbor entrance, transferring to other ships at sea. She was sufficiently repaired to fight. That was the only standard Nimitz had set. That same day in Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy had her listed as sunk. Japan's plan for the Battle of Midway was built around fighting 2 American carriers. They were sailing into a battle against 3. They couldn't know this, because the ship they believed was at the bottom of the Coral Sea was cutting northwest through the Pacific toward a position 300 miles northeast of Midway Atoll, where 2 other carriers were already waiting. The Japanese had designed a trap. What they had built was a box they were about to walk into themselves. This is what came before the 6 minutes of dive bombing that everyone remembers. The intelligence work, the command decisions, the weeks of preparation that determined what those 6 minutes would produce. Before we go on, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if you're loving this story, subscribe, because tomorrow we have something extra special waiting for you. 30 miles from where Yorktown was being welded back together, in a windowless room beneath the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, a man in bedroom slippers and a red smoking jacket was reading Yamamoto's mail. Commander Joseph Rochefort had been running Station Hypo, the Navy's Pacific code-breaking unit, since 1941. He had spent years learning Japanese, not just the language, but the institutional logic behind it, the way naval officers structured their communications, the abbreviations they favored, the patterns that repeated across message traffic. He slept on a cot in the corner when he slept at all. He ate at his desk. He had not been outside in days. The Japanese naval code his team was working against, designated JN-25B, had not been broken. That word matters. Not broken. Rochefort's team could read perhaps 10 to 15% of any intercepted message. The rest was either still encrypted or corrupted in transmission. 10 to 15% sounds like almost nothing. In the hands of a man who understood Japanese naval doctrine as thoroughly as Rochefort did, it was enough. Every phrase he could read told him something about the phrases he couldn't. The shape of a message, its length, its routing, the rank of the officer who sent it. These were data before a single word was deciphered. The way a forensic examiner identifies a body from a partial dental record, Rochefort was reconstructing operational intent from fragments. April 1942, those fragments were describing something large. A massive operation was coming. The target was designated in Japanese communications as AF. Rochefort was certain AF was Midway Atoll, 100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. Washington disagreed. Naval Intelligence Headquarters believed the evidence was ambiguous. AF could be the Aleutians. It could be the American West Coast. Their position was that Rochefort's conclusion was a plausible interpretation of incomplete data, not a confirmed intelligence picture. Reasonable if you were reading his conclusions on paper. Wrong. Rochefort needed proof Washington couldn't dismiss. He arranged for the Midway garrison to broadcast an unencrypted radio message in plain language, stating that the base's water desalination equipment had broken down. The atoll was running critically short of fresh water. 2 days later, his team intercepted a Japanese signals message reporting that AF was experiencing water shortages. Operational chatter, the kind of mundane supply communication sent in bulk and read by nobody important on either side. Rochefort read it. Washington went quiet. By late May, Rochefort had assembled enough of the picture to give Nimitz something that had never existed before in naval warfare: a detailed, specific, largely accurate enemy operational plan delivered 3 weeks before the battle it described. Not a general warning, a plan. The date of the attack, the approach vectors for the Japanese carrier force, the composition of the striking fleet, the timing of the initial airstrike, the coordinates where the Japanese carriers would be positioned when they launched it. Nimitz's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, converted Rochefort's raw intelligence into a single tactical prediction. The Japanese carriers would approach from the northwest, bearing 325 degrees from Midway, at a range of 175 nautical miles, arriving at approximately 0600 on June 4th. After the battle, Nimitz told Layton that his prediction had been 5 degrees, 5 miles, and 5 minutes off from what actually happened. 5 degrees, 5 miles, 5 minutes in an ocean. But knowing the enemy was coming is not the same as being able to stop him. The Japanese carrier force had conducted the raid on Pearl Harbor. It had swept through the Indian Ocean and driven British naval power from Asian waters. Its pilots were the most experienced carrier aviators in the world. Kido Butai had not lost a single major engagement in 6 months of continuous operations. Nimitz had 3 carriers, one of which his own engineers had called a 90-day repair job. His pilots were good. None of them had the accumulated combat hours of the men they were going to fight. Rochefort had handed Nimitz a map showing where the ambush would be. What Nimitz did with that map was something else entirely. The first decision was where to position the American carriers. Nimitz chose Point Luck, a coordinate 300 miles northeast of Midway. Placing his ships outside the area Japan's reconnaissance would search, while keeping them close enough to strike once the Japanese fleet committed to its attack on the island. The closer the Americans sat to Midway, the faster they could respond. The further they stayed from Japan's search patterns, the longer they remained undetected. Nimitz chose concealment. He was betting that the intelligence picture was accurate enough to put his ships in the right place without needing the flexibility of proximity. If Rochefort was wrong about the approach vectors, Point Luck was the wrong place to be. If Rochefort was right, it was precisely correct. The second decision was who would command. Admiral Halsey was hospitalized. Nimitz replaced him with Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a cruiser commander with no carrier aviation background, handed the most consequential naval command in American history with days to prepare. The officers around Nimitz received this choice the way they received most of what he did, which was with confusion. What Nimitz had seen in Spruance was not carrier expertise. It was a quality of judgment under pressure, the ability to hold a tactical objective, steady when everything around it was moving. The carriers needed an officer who would protect them as an instrument for winning the war, not spend them winning an engagement. Task Force 17, built around the damaged Yorktown, went to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who had more Pacific combat experience and had commanded carriers at Coral Sea. Fletcher held overall command of both task forces. Spruance operated independently under his general direction. The third decision was Yorktown. 2 carriers at Midway meant Japan held the numerical advantage in the air. 3 changed the arithmetic. Yorktown's presence would force Japan to split its fighter cover, divide its attention, respond to threats from multiple directions. Japan believed she was gone. Her appearance in the battle reports would confirm to Japanese commanders that their operational security had failed, that America had known they were coming, sent her anyway. He calculated that her tactical value outweighed the intelligence signal she would send, and that by the time the Japanese understood what that signal meant, it would be too late for the understanding to help them. He was right on both counts. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand what Nimitz was maneuvering against, you have to understand what Yamamoto had built. Japan had known since December 7th that failing to sink the American carriers was a problem. The battleships at Pearl Harbor had been devastated. Enterprise and Lexington were at sea that morning and escaped untouched. In the months that followed, those carriers raided Japanese positions across the Pacific. Then, in April 1942, 16 Army B-25s launched from a carrier reached Tokyo and dropped bombs on the Japanese home islands for the first time in history. The Doolittle raid did minimal physical damage. What it proved was that American carriers could operate close enough to Japan to threaten the home islands, and that Japanese air defenses hadn't detected them until response was impossible. The solution was a decisive engagement. Draw the American carriers out, concentrate the full weight of Japanese naval air power against them, and destroy them before American industrial production made the balance of forces irretrievable. Midway was the bait. Close enough to Hawaii that America couldn't afford to lose it. Small enough to seize with a moderate ground force. Far enough from Pearl Harbor that American carriers would have to sail into range of the assembled Japanese fleet to defend it. The force Yamamoto built around this logic was enormous. 8 carriers, 11 battleships, 22 cruisers, 65 destroyers, 21 submarines. Against it, Nimitz had 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers, no battleships. On paper, Japan held every advantage: numbers, experience, tactical doctrine refined over months of continuous combat operations. What they didn't have, and what no number of ships could replace, was the thing Rochefort had already taken from them. They didn't know they had been read. Yamamoto's plan required 5 things to be true. The American carriers would be at Pearl Harbor and wouldn't reach Midway until after the island fell. A submarine picket line between Hawaii and Midway would detect any American movement. Aerial reconnaissance over Pearl Harbor would confirm carrier locations before the battle. Midway's air garrison would be destroyed in the opening strike, and the American carriers, when they finally responded, would sail into a fleet prepared for them. By the time the Japanese fleet crossed its line of departure, every assumption was wrong. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had sailed before the submarine picket lines reached their stations. The submarines arrived at their designated positions after the American carriers had already passed through. The screen that was supposed to give Yamamoto time to respond never saw anything. The aerial reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor, a seaplane mission designated Operation K, required a submarine to surface at French frigate shoals and refuel the aircraft. When the submarine arrived, it found an American ship already anchored there. Nimitz had placed vessels at the refueling points the Japanese reconnaissance plan depended on. Operation K was canceled. Nobody in Japanese Fleet Command adjusted their tactical assumptions in response. The American carriers were at sea. Japan didn't know it. The operation continued as planned. Yamamoto had built a machine to manufacture surprise. The machine had failed before anyone fired a shot. At 0600 on June 4th, Japanese aircraft from all 4 carriers of the Kido Butai struck Midway Island. The attack was substantial. It damaged installations and cost the island's air garrison heavily. The strike commander radioed back that a second attack would be needed before a landing could proceed. That message matters more than the bombs. Aboard the carrier Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was now facing a decision. His carriers had been armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, configured to attack ships. A second strike on Midway meant rearming with land attack ordnance. But reports had just come in of American ships in the area. Carriers were among them. He needed the torpedo configuration he already had. He chose Midway. He ordered the rearming to begin. In the hangar bays below Akagi's flight deck, crews began swapping ordnance. Torpedoes down, land attack bombs up. The work takes time. More time than Nagumo had. His carriers were also recovering aircraft returning from the Midway strike. Flight decks crowded with planes landing, planes being refueled, planes being moved to make room. Below decks, torpedoes and bombs were stacked in passageways because there was no time to stow them properly. Then word came that American carriers had been positively identified. Nagumo ordered another rearming, back to torpedoes. The cruise below decks began again. At this moment, the Japanese carriers were in the most vulnerable state a carrier can occupy. Multiple rearming cycles, ordnance loose in the passageways, fueled aircraft covering the decks, fighter screen thinned by combat operations against Midway's air forces, and incoming, wave after wave of American torpedo bombers flying slow, straight approaches directly at the fleet. The attacks failed. The aircraft were Douglas Devastators, already being phased out of American squadrons. Slow enough that 0 fighters could engage them at leisure. Squadron after squadron was shot down before reaching a viable release point. From Torpedo Squadron 8, launched from Hornet, every aircraft was destroyed. 30 aircrew, 1 survivor, Ensign George Gay, floating under a seat cushion, watching the ships that had killed his squadron through his fingers. The torpedo attacks accomplished nothing tactically. The torpedoes that reached release were evaded. No Japanese carrier was hit. What they accomplished, at a cost that resists accounting, was this. They pulled the Japanese fighter screen down to sea level. The 0 pilots followed the Devastators down to low altitude, where the intercepts were easier and the kills straightforward. They were there, at wave height, when Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey arrived overhead with 33 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise. McCluskey had nearly missed the fleet entirely. He'd flown to the calculated intercept position and found empty ocean. Nagumo had changed course during the engagement, and the coordinates Rochefort's intelligence had predicted were no longer accurate in real time. McCluskey's aircraft were burning fuel. He had roughly 15 minutes before he'd have to turn back. He turned northwest and searched. 20 minutes later, he spotted a white wake below him, the destroyer Arashi, running at flank speed to rejoin the main fleet after spending the morning depth charging an American submarine. McCluskey followed her. At 10:22, he found the Kido Butai. Below him, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, crowded decks, ordnance in the passageways, no fighter cover above 1,000 feet. At the same moment, without any coordination, 17 Dauntless bombers from Yorktown led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived above Soryu from a different direction. 2 attack groups, 3 targets, no communication between them. They had converged simultaneously because both were following the same intelligence picture to the same coordinates, and the geometry of their approaches had resolved into the same moment. Nobody planned this. It happened anyway. In 6 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning from the inside out. The stacked ordnance was cooking off in the hangars. Fueled aircraft fed the fires on the decks. 3 of Japan's 4 frontline fleet carriers were dying at the same time, and the men on each one could look across the water and see the smoke rising from the others. Here is what the standard account of Midway misses. The 6 minutes of dive bombing were not the decision. They were the consequence of a series of decisions made by one man over the preceding 3 weeks, each one building on the intelligence that Rochefort had developed. One designed to put American aircraft in precisely the position where 6 minutes like that were possible. Tokyo had studied Nimitz carefully. The Japanese Naval General Staff's intelligence assessment, compiled in the spring of 1942, had concluded that he could not be provoked into acting before he was ready. They had identified this quality and labeled it correctly. They had understood it as a characteristic that made him dangerous in a specific way, different from Halsey's aggression, different from the commanders whose patterns could be read and planned against. What Tokyo had not understood, could not have understood from the outside, was what that quality was built on in the specific context of Midway. Nimitz had not simply been patient. He had been patient because he knew something that allowed patience to be a weapon rather than a liability. He knew where the Japanese fleet would be. He knew when it would be there. He knew what configuration the carriers would be in when they arrived. He knew that Japan's reconnaissance had failed and that his ships were sailing to Point Luck undetected. He knew that Yorktown, the carrier Japan had written off, was at sea and would be there. Every decision he made in the 3 weeks before June 4th, Point Luck instead of a closer position, Spruance, instead of a more senior carrier commander, 72 hours on the Yorktown repair. These were not acts of intuition. They were acts of applied intelligence. He was making decisions from a position of knowledge that his opponent did not know he had. The Japanese had built a trap for an enemy who was operating blind. Nimitz was not blind. He was reading the blueprints for the trap while it was still being assembled. This is the specific asymmetry that determined the outcome of the battle before a single aircraft left a flight deck. Japan had numbers, experience, and tactical doctrine on their side. Nimitz had one thing they didn't: an accurate picture of what was about to happen. He used that picture to position his ships, choose his commanders, and preserve his resources for the moment when they could do the most damage. The Japanese were fighting the battle they had planned. Nimitz was fighting the battle he knew was actually coming. This is where precision matters, because the intelligence picture had limits, and understanding those limits is part of the forensic account. Rochefort's team could tell Nimitz where the Japanese carriers would be and when. They could not tell him what would happen after the first shots were fired. They could not predict that McCluskey would find empty ocean at his initial intercept coordinates, or that he would spot the Arashi and follow her, or that Leslie's bombers from Yorktown would arrive above Soryu. At the same moment, McCluskey was pushing over on Akagi and Kaga. They could not predict that Hiryu, the fourth Japanese carrier, was positioned far enough from the other three that she survived the initial dive, bombing entirely unscathed. Hiryu's captain, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, launched 2 counterstrikes immediately. He knew what had happened. He knew his window was closing. Both strikes found Yorktown. Multiple bomb hits, then 2 torpedo hits. The ship Nimitz had sent to sea in 72 hours, still carrying wet welds, took devastating damage and was abandoned. For several hours on June 4th, the battle was genuinely uncertain. Hiryu had eliminated one of 3 American carriers and had aircraft ready for another strike. If she had launched before American scout planes found her, the battle's outcome was not fixed. A scout aircraft from the damaged Yorktown located Hiryu. Dive bombers from Enterprise found her at 1700, 4 direct hits. She burned through the night. The intelligence picture had given Nimitz the conditions for victory. The men who flew through Japanese fighter screens, the torpedo bomber crews who died in straight approaches against carriers, whose guns were tracking them from the first moment, the dive bomber pilots who pushed over at 10,000 feet knowing the anti-aircraft fire was going to come up at them. They were the ones who converted those conditions into the battle's actual outcome. Rochefort's work made it possible. The men who flew made it real. On June 5th, Yamamoto received the preliminary battle reports on the bridge of Yamato. He had lost 4 fleet carriers, the Kido Butai. The strike force that had gone 6 months without a single major defeat was gone. He had done the arithmetic before any of this. He had done it in Texas oil fields in 1919, and in Washington offices in the late 1920s, and in his own quarters during the weeks before Midway, when he was lobbying his own high command to approve a plan he privately knew was fragile. He had understood that American industrial capacity would eventually produce a fleet Japan could not match. He had bet at Midway that destroying the American carriers before that fleet arrived would give Japan enough leverage to negotiate a settlement. He had been right about the timeline. He had been right about the production numbers. He had been wrong about the battle. By the end of 1942, the United States produced approximately 47,000 military aircraft. Japan produced fewer than 9,000. In 1943, American production surpassed 85,000. In the 3 years after Midway, Japan would build 6 aircraft carriers. The United States would build 17. Those numbers did not change because of what happened at Midway. They were already in motion, already locked in by factory capacity and raw material flows and training pipelines that Yamamoto had studied with his own eyes 20 years earlier. Midway determined was whether Japan would have the carrier air power to contest those numbers when they arrived. The answer, after June 4th, 1942, was no. There is a particular irony in the intelligence dimension of this story that deserves its own paragraph. Yamamoto had specifically warned his own staff that American codebreakers might have penetrated JN-25. He raised this concern not as an abstract possibility, but as a specific operational risk. His staff dismissed it. The cryptographers had provided assurances that the code was unbreakable, and in a culture that had won every battle for 6 months, when your cryptographers tell you something is unbreakable, you believe them. The same concern he had raised, dismissed, and then, overridden in his own planning was precisely what destroyed his fleet on June 4th. Rochefort's water desalination trick, dummy message that confirmed AF, was Midway, was elegant. What made it possible was something more fundamental. Yamamoto had identified the vulnerability. His own institution had decided it wasn't worth worrying about. And the operation he had fought to get approved proceeded on the assumption that the answer to the question he had raised was no. His predictions about American capability were vindicated at every point. His fleet was still at the bottom of the Pacific. On the morning of June 6th, Chester Nimitz issued a communique to the fleet. He named the ships that had fought. He named the men who had led them. He stated the results. He did not editorialize. In Pearl Harbor, the newspapers covered the battle as a victory. The headlines focused on the carriers, on the Japanese losses, on the strategic significance. MacArthur issued a statement from the Southwest Pacific, calling it a tribute to American fighting spirit. Nimitz went back to work. He had 3 more years of war ahead of him. He had islands to take, supply lines to maintain, commanders to place and replace, and a Japanese Navy that was damaged but not finished. Guadalcanal was 2 months away. The Philippine Sea was 2 years away. There were still battles to be fought and men to be killed, and decisions to be made that no intelligence picture could make for him. Rochefort had given him at Midway was extraordinary and unrepeatable in its specific form. Japan would change codes. Japan would tighten operational security. Japan would not again send an operation plan in fragments across a code that American analysts had spent years learning to read. What Rochefort could not give him, and what Nimitz had always understood he was working without, was certainty. The intelligence picture was accurate about the big things: the place, the time, the composition of the Japanese fleet. It could not tell him whether McCluskey would find the fleet after his initial coordinates came up empty. It could not tell him whether the Yorktown would last long enough to matter. The decisions Nimitz made before the battle created conditions. The men who flew converted conditions into outcomes. Both mattered. The distinction matters. In the spring of 1942, inside the Japanese Naval General Staff, an intelligence officer had written that Nimitz could not be provoked into acting before he was ready. The assessment was correct. What the assessment could not capture was why that quality, at Midway specifically, was so dangerous. Nimitz was not waiting out of caution. He was not waiting because he lacked aggression or will. He was waiting because he had information his opponent did not know he had, and patience in that position is not a passive quality. It is a precision instrument. Every day he waited was a day Yamamoto's fleet was sailing into a position Nimitz had already chosen for it. Every decision he deferred was a decision he was saving for the moment when the intelligence picture told him it could be made with maximum effect. Tokyo had studied the man for months and understood his character accurately. What they had not understood, could not have understood, was that his character in this specific case was operating on information their own operation had compromised before it began. They had built their trap around assumptions that were already false. They had launched their fleet on the basis of reconnaissance that never happened. They had coded their operational plan in a cipher that a man in bedroom slippers had been reading for months. Chester Nimitz knew it. They didn't know he knew it. That gap between what one side understood about the battle and what the other side understood about the same battle was not 5 degrees or 5 miles or 5 minutes. It was the difference between an ambush and the defeat of the ambush, between a trap and the thing the trap caught. The Japanese had sailed to Midway to destroy the American fleet. They brought 4 carriers to do it. they came back with none. That's our story. If you enjoyed it, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. And tomorrow, more stories are waiting for you. Thanks for watching.